let's get this meeting started. All right. Hi, I'm Eric Jensen of Jensen Strategies. I'm the facilitator for the ADV work group. And welcome to the 8th meeting of the ADV work group. We have, as usual, a lot to cover during this meeting. And so we're going to try to make the best use of our time as we go through this. But just kind of recap, because I know folks that did see the agenda in advance, but we are going to be focusing on the proposed ADV program framework that DSL has put together, and an opportunity for Josh and his team to be able to go through those different elements as proposed, as well as then having some discussion about those elements after that, after he gets through, or the team gets through with the presentation. And we will have an opportunity, as always, for community input toward the end of the meeting. Next slide, we have just the contact information, as you've seen before, for myself and Kate, our community engagement officer on this, and Josh, the waterway stewardship manager. This is the proper title. All right. Moving on, just want to remind those of you in the work group that as we go through this meeting, please raise your hands to speak or to ask questions. When you're called on, remember to share your name and your organization or interest. Keep in mind, we have very limited airtime for this meeting, and so if you can keep your comments and questions brief and to the point, to allow the most people the ability, the time to talk, that would be great. I'm going to call on people in the order of the hands that go up. The exception to that is with the DSL staff, which I will call on DSL staff at that time, in case they have comments that they would like to share relevant to what the speaker is talking about. And please remember that the discussion period is only for the work group members. There will be, as I mentioned before, opportunity for community engagement. Now, there is a public process and there are multiple opportunities for information and input. Times allocated at every meeting for community input at these meetings. And I'll give more protocol on that later in the meeting. The meeting information and materials are posted on the website a week in advance, so everybody has access to that. Recordings are also made available after the meeting, and there's also a public comment period coming up with regard to the ADV program early this year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, who I think is going to talk a little bit about schedule.
Yes, thank you very much, Eric, for the introduction there and starting us off. So first up on the screen now is the anticipated schedule for the next 3 scheduled meetings. A little bit of this has changed from what we sent out last week. We've moved some things around slightly. So the initial plan was to discuss legislative concepts in 2 weeks, and then to talk about the public's involvement, including the work group, with the state's ADV program going forward. I'm going to kind of change that up so that we discuss the public involvement and the work group role going forward at the next meeting. I think it's something that we have touched on a couple times throughout the course of these meetings, but I think it's something that I want to revisit in more detail soon. So we're going to do that on January 23rd. And then we can start talking about substance on legislative concepts at the next meeting scheduled for March 19th. And then possibly the next meeting after that, depending on our needs. But that's what you can expect for the next 3 meetings. And I'll give you a little bit more of a primer for what to think about for the meeting next week at the end of this one. Like how do we see public involvement? How would you all like to see yourselves involved with the different aspects of this program going forward. So that's going to be what we're going to do in 2 weeks.
Okay.
So I'm going to try to briefly talk about the draft program framework the next 15 minutes or so. And I've broken the framework down into 9 categories, many of which will reflect the different topic areas that we discussed at previous meetings. As you'll see within each of these categories, there are some broad functions and tasks within each one that, based on your input, we see the program addressing. Initially, I'm going to go through all of the slides associated with these categories in their entirety, so you all get a sense of the program holistically. And then at the end, I'm going to hand off to Eric to revisit each of these categories individually, and allow you all to suggest changes, additions, revisions, potential clarifications. And I also want to point out that this slide deck and the way that it's organized is the basis for the framework document that we will be circulating for public comment soon, probably in roughly 2 weeks. And if you have other thoughts other than outside of what's discussed today, by all means, please contact me with those. Our goal for the next week or two is to incorporate all that input into the framework as currently drafted, and then put that out for public review. So again, if you have some questions regarding anything I say right now, hold them till the end, because we're going to go through the slides and then come back to the top of the slide deck to talk about each component individually. I think that will be the best way to facilitate getting good input. So the first component that we're going to touch on is funding sources. We're acknowledging that reliable funding is necessary for ongoing success of the program. So given that, we're going to look at the viability of collecting revenue through some established mechanisms, ones we discussed right before Christmas, recreational boat registrations being one, and through fees associated with Department of State lands, leases, and other waterway authorizations. Those are established mechanisms that we can look into potentially tapping into. And then the other is to look at the viability of collecting revenue through a new mechanism. And the main one that we identified was commercial boat registrations or permits, or some sort of moorage fee associated with commercial watercraft. Okay, you can go to, there we go, perfect. So the next few slides are all about use of the fund and availability of the fund to different entities. We know we need to have the internal capacity to see removal through from beginning to end, soup to nuts, so to speak, meaning that we are able to conduct the procurement for services, we can adequately do contract oversight, and everything else needed to see one of these jobs through. Currently, we do have the capacity to procure contracted services for this type of removal, including towing, salvage, diving, transport, dismantling, and also any kind of environmental impact mitigation that we would need to contract out. And we also have the capacity to oversee contracted services to make sure that certain deliverables are met. Just everything that we would need to administrate a contract with a complex vessel removal. The statewide price agreements that we discussed in a previous meeting, 2 of which have been solidified, they will contribute to our ability to achieve this function efficiently. We also know that many entities, many represented here, would like some mechanism in which they can utilize the fund or get financial relief in some way from it, which could potentially look like handing off a removal effort to DSL, given the capacity I just mentioned. At this point, we're willing to look at all ways in which that type of thing could be available to all types of entities. And that includes, at this point, and certainly is not limited to, state agencies, ports, local jurisdictions, private moorage operators. But with all that being said, looking into this is also accompanied by a look at necessary sideboards, just given funding limitations, and just differences in priorities between the state, local parties, and other entities. And then the last thing regarding the fund use, go ahead, Kate. We've also talked a lot about vessel turn-in programs as being a viable prevention solution to mitigate the fact that responsible boat disposal is neither cheap or always readily available. We're committed to looking at this idea more and want to employ lessons learned from both efforts in Oregon, as mentioned on the slide, but also from other states. This is not necessarily a new idea to Oregon. And so we're going to look at how that could be administered effectively, but again, also understand that in broader considerations about how a limited budget can and should be used. So the next thing we have is reporting, mapping, classifying of different vessels. And I'm going to hand this off to my colleague, Dorothy Deal, who has been focused on this as a lot of her work since starting with the agency last year. So Dorothy, if you want to take this, feel free.
Yeah, so there's actually quite a bit represented here on this slide in terms of work that will happen. Obviously, we're well aware that stakeholders are interested in a central repository for providing ADV reports, and then also some type of interface for seeing that those reports have been received, seeing that agencies are responding to ADVs and following up on what the status of that is in some sort of passive way where they can just go and see that information. And so there's a couple of examples that we've seen that can serve as pretty good models for what the public interface could look like. One of those is with the state of Washington. One is with the state of Florida. So we'll be looking at the viability of kind of pulling some ideas from both of those and then seeing, what's going to work for us in the short term and then long term. But then the next piece on the slide, which will happen concurrently with those efforts, which you'll start to see right away, is developing the criteria for classifying ADVs. And so what I mean by classifying is gathering all of the information that is necessary to aid in decision making, determining how resources should be allocated. And so it's more than just having we have tables with the length of a vessel and those kind of details, but I want to start really showing the whole picture of a vessel, the legal and civil penalty status of it, the risks that it poses to environment and public safety, just kind of like a point in time, like status of everything that you would need to know about a vessel in order to make decisions, and to have that be consistent from vessel to vessel so that you're collecting all of the same types of information about them. And so that's going to involve a lot of field work, going and actually visiting these sites, getting pictures, video, learning characteristics of the waterway and the surrounding area and everything so that the vessels can really be understood and we can communicate and compare them effectively. And then I think maybe I have something on the next slide too. So continuing the theme of, people want a central repository for ADV reports and information. We're also anticipating that, people will be reaching out to DSL, hoping that there is a sole source of information about responding to ADVs. There's an expectation that jurisdictions, especially ones that haven't handled an ADV before, or maybe the last time their jurisdiction had an ADV, there's been turnover and the person who handled it last time, is no longer available. And so we're going to try to anticipate what a lot of those questions and wants are going to be, so that we can be ready with good information for people if it's information that DSL can provide. But we also know that there will be times when people are seeking information And we just need to be able to quickly direct them to the very best place to get accurate, solid information that's going to help them. And, you know, in some cases, it'll be something where we can't advise the organization or the individual on what to do if it has to do with like foreclosing a lien on an abandoned boat or something like that. But we do need to anticipate what those questions and needs are going to be so that we know where we can direct people.
Thank you, Dorothy. Hold on, I had a technical problem right now because right now I'm just looking at Andrew Mason's screen and not somehow the presentation. Hi, Andrew. Swap video and shared screen. Okay. Sorry. Thank you, Dorothy. Okay, where was I? Okay, so the next thing that we're going to discuss briefly here is this idea of prevention. We know there's a desire for efforts to stop vessels from becoming the financial burden of others. That's what I'm getting at with prevention. Whether it's the state or other entities, again, some of which are represented here. We're going to continue to look into how insurance and bonding can serve to mitigate some of these impacts to others, whether those industries can be inserted in a way that keeps some of the responsibility on parties that have the responsibility in causing an issue. We're also going to see what measures can be taken within DSL leaseholds to curb ADV development and proliferation. If there are efforts that we can employ to maybe stop certain circumstances from becoming a bigger problem if they are under the department's purview already. And then the last thing is to look at a mechanism similar to the secondary liability provisions in Washington law, where those that relinquish ownership of a boat may still be held financially liable for costs associated with that boat, depending on where it might end up in certain circumstances. We've heard some support for that. There seems to be some viability in that helping to curb the overall problem to some extent. Go ahead, Kate. Thank you. It's also clear that vessel disposal, or really vessel salvage, removal and disposal, especially of complex boats, is hard. We're committed to consulting with environmental agencies, including obviously, but not limited to DEQ, to understand where we can work together so that we understand the things that need to happen for a vessel removal to happen in an environmentally conscious and legal manner, and then also be able to convey that to contractors or other people that come to us looking for advice and assistance on how to address an ADV type situation. We're also going to see if outside of just environmental regulations, if there are other ways that we can streamline the disposal process to save resources, and if there are things that we can do to facilitate more efficient disposal practices down the road. That's something that certainly needs more exploration, but is there an opportunity for the state to better support infrastructure that allows more efficient boat removal disposal in the state of Oregon? What I mean by process and procedure improvement is, and this is mainly going to be something that would make up a legislative concept, would be relating to waterway waste and to account for the fact that ADVs in many cases are no longer meeting the definition of a boat, and yet we still, through the current statutes, must treat them like a boat, which can be a lengthy, difficult storage process, notifications, things that make removal and dealing with some ADVs an administrative challenge. The reality is many of the statutes that we still currently use to address ADVs were written decades ago at a time where they were written to address kind of a different problem or not with our current problem in mind. So one of the directions that we would like to look at for a legislative concept would be essentially, is there a way for our statutes to allow for, hey, if this is garbage removal and not necessarily a vessel at this point in time, is there a streamlined process that we could go through that might eliminate some of those unnecessarily burdensome and sometimes fairly costly steps? We touched on the needs for outreach and education a few times, the different throughout our different topics. I think what we can say right now is we're committed to utilizing the best practices for identifying parties affected by ADVs, some of which are represented here and some of which we know probably aren't. So identifying those and looking at how we can share pertinent information effectively. And then also looking into established channels that we can tap into for providing information to anyone that might need that information. So that the public is informed on what they need to know regarding ADVs, what they can do to prevent ADVs potentially, and also what resources are available to them if they're in a situation where they have an old boat or something to that effect. And I think I got one last slide, which is a category that's not really a category. It's just things that didn't fit anywhere else. And we're committed to keeping communication with other state, federal entities, local entities that have a nexus with ADVs, the overall ADV boat issue. Immediately comes to mind is the U.S. Coast Guard and NOAA, as well as the Oregon State Marine Board and DEQ. Just to make sure that we are all kind of on the same page. We're going to facilitate those conversations, making sure that we're up to speed on what we need to know to be effective in mitigating the state's ADV issues. Something else that we're committed to doing, and this stems from some of the conversations we've had in the work group, are to utilize all the legal tools at our disposal when dealing with non-compliance with our current pertinent laws. And that's utilizing, liens, civil penalties, other restitution measures. We've heard loud and clear that there is on some level a desire for those current laws to be pursued and those legal mechanisms to be used. And then the last thing is to make sure that we have the ability, we have self-reliance when we're accessing sites, maybe doing some sort of field reconnaissance, carrying out an administrative task like certain seizure tasks, that we are able to do that. At this point, that could mean, making sure that vehicles and watercraft are available. So what I'm saying here is we're going to assess our field needs and to make sure that we have the equipment and personnel necessary to do all the administrative parts of this program effectively. So that's all I got. This is a question that we'll revisit kind of at the end of this meeting. So at this point, Kate, I'd like you to go back to the initial slide regarding funding. Eric, I'd like to pass it to you if that's okay. And I'd like you to lead us through these different categories or groups of tasks and functions, whatever you want to call them. And just solicit input from the group. Again, anything that feels like it's that we've talked about that feels glaringly missing. Any other suggestions? That's what we're looking for today. I know we have 9 different categories and an hour and 15 minutes to maybe get through them. So please be considerate of that to an extent. But make sure that you take this opportunity to tell us where we're right and more importantly, where we're wrong. So Eric, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Josh. And just to reiterate what Josh just said, we do have a limited amount of time here, so keep your comments and questions as succinct as possible, but without losing the substance of what you're trying to communicate. We've got, with 75 minutes, we've got about 8 minutes per element. We're not going to stick directly to that, but just to kind of give you an idea of what we're working with here. We do want to keep this discussion as we go through these different, and I'm going to call them elements of the ADV program. As we go through these elements, keep them at a high level, recognizing that what was is shared today is a broad brush framework, and there are plenty of details yet to be worked out. So to that end, and then also just paralleling what Josh said, I'd like to encourage the group as we go through each of the elements to focus in on 3 questions. The first question is there anything significant missing relevant to that particular program element? So in other words, we're not talking about the minutia of implementation per se, but rather the overall scope and approach of that element and the function of that element. Second is, what are the biggest challenges for this element that you see? And third, is there any concept, role, approach to that element that the ADV of the proposed ADV program that causes you concern? I do want to also point out or suggest that we do have a chat function here. We are not going to be going back to the chat to look for questions or for a dialogue, but if you have something that you would like to communicate that you don't necessarily feel you need a response, but you want DSL to be thinking about, please feel free to capture that in the chat, and Kate's going to be monitoring that, and all that information will be captured as well as the discussion today. So, so with that, let's kind of dive into it and talk about the permanent funding sources and mechanisms. And Abby, you had your hand up first.
Great, thank you, Abby Baduris, DEQ. And it's a question about the amount of money. I don't need to know the amount, but I'm just wondering, when you add up what could be gotten from boat registrations and leases, will that add to something that approaches what you think we'll need on an annual basis, or do we need to add something else to supplement?
Josh, do you have an idea about that?
Yeah, I can answer that succinctly. So, I mean, in some ways, I don't know for sure. The answer could be no. Something I kind of glossed over here on this slide is that while we don't consider federal funding or even just other available grants as a sustainable funding source, we do view it as probably a substantial part of the program. There are a lot of resources out there, and when we've now built the capacity to make sure that we can effectively tap into that, and we expect that will be a primary funding component. I don't want to say majority or anything like that at this point. So that's part of it. We see that supporting as far as just the day-to-day, year-to-year of the program. I think we'll look at the ones that are on the screen now, talk about, how viable these are and for how much, and then go from there. So that's not a hard answer, Abby, I'm sorry. It's the most I could give you at this point without starting to, I mean, the reality is anytime you talk about funding, you start to get into some political realities that we're going to have to navigate.
Thank you, Josh, and no pun intended on navigate. So thank you very much for that. Rachel, you are next.
Hi, thank you. So my question is related similarly to Abby's question. Where do the recreation...
If I could interject for a second, if I could ask folks to introduce themselves and their organization at the beginning.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Rachel Fisher, I'm with the National Marine Manufacturers Association. Sorry about that. So with the recreational boat registrations, I'm wondering if that fee already goes into OSMB and if it funds any other programs, or how much would be siphoned off. Is there a percentage ideally that you're looking forward to, or anything related to where the funding is going now and how much of that could we expect to see put to this program, if that question makes any sense?
It makes plenty of sense, Rachel. So the answer is similar to what I had provided earlier. A lot of that is at this point unknown. I can tell you that recreational boat registration fees right now do support marine law enforcement, boating facilities around the state, and also functions of the Oregon State Marine Board regarding how much, I wouldn't use the word siphon off, but how much of that could be also utilized for a state ADV program. Again, that's where the discussions will occur.
Thanks.
Thanks. Stan?
Stan Tonneson, Rocky Point Marina and WU board member. Josh, you may have answered my question on the funding from the Marine Board, but one source might be from their general budget as well. Currently, it's just $150,000. We could ask for a little more from there, because I'm assuming that the registration fees, boat registration fees, are an additional fee we're discussing. So I'm just suggesting that the Marine Board be required to provide a little bit more funding. I know it's tough, but all these are tough. Secondly, and lastly, the DSL leases and so forth goes back to the first question. How much are you thinking about getting? I know there's going to be a lot of pushback. There was 10, 15 years ago when insurance requirements were mandated on our DSL leases, just costing another $1,000 a year. Are we looking at, 1,000, 5,000, what percent increase? So just some considerations. Thank you.
Sure, and I'll try to briefly address both of those. And I also, if you have questions on any of these that are not sufficiently answered, please reach out to me and I can give you maybe a much more detailed response than I can give now. Regarding the Marine Board budget, I mean, whether it's their general budget or from fees, that is the Marine Board budget. It's supported by boater fees. It's not a general fund agency, so you're kind of saying the same thing either way. What was the second part? Regarding the leases and again, I'm not at the point where I can give any kind of numbers or even suggested numbers. I think the reality is we look at all the work around the state that needs to occur in the realm of ADVs. There's a lot out there. So some of this will be a broader discussion on what, the Oregon at large, including the legislature and all its citizens, are willing to contribute to this issue. There's a backlog of work that needs to happen. So again, that's where we will look into. That's what that means.
Great, thank you, Josh. Stan, your hand's still up. I just didn't know if there was a follow-up. You're on mute. There you go. Okay. All right. Any other comments or questions with regard to the element about permanent funding sources and mechanisms, recognizing this is a broad brush picture right now. Not seeing any, we're going to jump to the next topic, which is the abandoned and derelict fund use. Does anybody have comments or questions with regard to the approach outlined here? Give a moment for people to find the raise your hand function. Sometimes it takes a while. And by the way, if you are on a phone, you can do *9 and that will do the same thing. Okay, so I'm not seeing that anything's missing, not seeing any immediate concerns with as far as this goes. So I'm going to suggest that we move on to the next topic unless anybody else raised their hand. Okay. And so this is on the same topic. So I don't think we have anything here. No. All right, Kate, I think we're ready to keep going here. And this is again on the same topic and talking about learning from more recent vessel turning programs from Metro and others. So okay, I'm not seeing any hands up, so I'm trusting that you folks are feeling, as far as this goes right now, that this is okay. There's not anything missing. There's not something you think there's a challenge. I I do appreciate those that are contributing to the chat. As I said, we're not going to go back and look at the chat for the discussion purpose, but it is, anything you put there is going to be captured as input from this session. All right, we've got some hands coming up, and Mike, you are first. Mike, oh, you're on mute.
All right, I think I'm there. Sorry about that. Having technical difficulties today. So I'm gonna go 3 slides back on you, and I wanted to make sure.
Mike, if I may interject, would you like
Mike
to introduce yourself?
Bay.
Thank you.
Back 3 slides to our first slide, and I know there was a lot of discussion, Josh, that we had about a reimbursement program, and that, to me, none of that says that. It says you can oversee contracts or you can contract directly. I want to make sure that
So,
is also an option that you're looking at.
Kate, can you go to the second fund use slide? So,
Okay, there it is. Okay.
in here, I was trying to make sure that I accommodated all of those potential mechanisms, including, reimbursement for costs, as well as a grant for upfront for costs, and then trying to leave that very broad for all the entities, of which there are many, that would probably like to see relief in some way. So I say those things are still, I think, completely on the table and worth exploring more. I would also kind of tie that into the conversation that we just had about funding, though, and understanding that there's going to have to be some sort of sideboards on the who or how these funds are available, with what will always be a limited amount of financial resources. But I was trying to capture what you would be looking for in the language on this slide.
And I see it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Chris?
Yeah, hey, Chris Hathaway, Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership, and my question or comment almost also had to do with this slide. And as somebody who's like written a bunch of grants, and almost our entire program is funded by grants, when I see something like grants, to me, that means an application process and a review committee and scoring and grant guidelines and all that. And that seems like a whole lot of administrative work on DSL's behalf to set something like that up for this. And I guess I was just wondering if that's really what you had in mind, or a competitive grant program, because I'm not sure that makes the most sense here, I guess.
Chris, I would say that the idea of a competitive grant program was not necessarily how I envisioned that, at least the way that's written. It was more of just, hey, we've identified an entity that's looking to do ADV work that meets our priorities. We want to make money available. I'm just using grant as another word for reimbursement. So we understand that for certain entities, bearing an upfront cost of some sort of large removal effort might not be feasible. And so the idea with the grants, at least there, was to allow another mechanism to have that funding available prior to work actually being done. I'm not going to completely discount the idea of a competitive grant program. I'd say at this point, that's probably not one of the primary functions of the ADV program, at least in its early stages, especially as we try to catch up with the work that we know that needs to be done around the state.
Thanks. Thanks for clarifying that. Next up, we have Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things I noticed here and just as I'm reading through this is I haven't seen anything about the capacity for shipbreaking, destruction, and waste stream, because I know that was one of the challenges that came out of dealing with the alert and the Saccharissa. And just knowing that even if you have the funds to address these, to remove these ADV, do you actually have plans for the capacity who would deal with them once they're out of the environment. And that was one thing I don't think I've seen in here.
Andrew, you're with NOAA? Okay, just
Apologies, yes. Andrew Mason, NOAA Marine Debris Program Pacific Lead and Pacific Northwest Regional Coordinator.
thank you for that. Yep. Josh?
Well, I just think Andrew's right, that was certainly a challenge that we have identified through this process that at this point is far from resolved. I think I'll make sure that we incorporate some language to capture that need and then to figure out how we facilitate shipbreaking ability here in the state. I know that's a continued challenge, so I'll make sure that is identified in our final product. Thank you for that input. It's an important omission, at least from what's been presented so far.
Okay, I don't see any other hands going up, and unless folks want to talk more about the abandoned derelict fund use, can we move down to the reporting, mapping, and classifying element? So in this case, with DSL, establishing a central repository for ADV reports and mechanisms. Any thoughts? Is there anything missing from what's being described here? Or anything that you think may be a particular challenge? Everybody's very comfortable with the way this is outlined. Stephanie.
Everybody, Stephanie Rawson with Metro. Just doesn't necessarily need to be answered now, but when I think about a centralized system, what comes to mind is the expectation all abandoned and derelict vessels, regardless of where they're located, would all be reported directly to DSL, and then DSL would work with the appropriate entities, or would there be some sort of or are you thinking there'd be some sort of relationship with local entities in helping update and keep this updated? For example, as a program that deals with dumped and abandoned items, we deal with a lot of boats that are on, on land, along in water, depending on who's the public entity, that doesn't necessarily get reported to Oregon State Marine Board or DSL or tap into the existing reimbursement program. So however you develop the reporting, if wants everything being centralized to you, my recommendation is thinking how that could be streamlined through like an online reporting tool to just kind of get that information, because that could also increase work. I like the idea. My brain just kind of stuck a little bit on implementation, so I don't want to get us in the weeds, but just something to think about.
And
I think that's good. And Stephanie, we've talked about what an online reporting tool could look like, but we're also, I think, understand that the primary goal of this is not to have some sort of map that has a dot for every boat that anyone thought was an ADV at any point. We want to make sure that a reporting tool also meets, our needs. I mean, it feeds into getting us information. But the goal, the map is not the goal in and of itself. It's to inform our efforts so funds are spent efficiently, responsibly, and with as much information as we can gather. So there would likely be quite a bit of vetting between information that would come in versus what would be portrayed to the public. As far as I don't see a scenario in which someone reports a boat at place A with these circumstances, and then that is immediately shown to the public at large, immediately. There would be kind of a difference there, at least in our mind, but still, this is something that we're working on now, but still, in many ways, it's kind of in its infancy.
Great. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Stephanie, for a great question. So with regard to the reporting and mapping classification, any other thoughts? What about looking at the bottom part of the slide, or the bottom 2/3, if you will, and exploring options for displaying the reports and responses on an interactive web map. Any thoughts about that in terms of models that would be looked at, or anything that should be thought about in looking at those options? Stephanie?
Definitely with Metro again. I was just writing a message about this in the chat, so I'll stop typing. My suggestion was going to be is to look at like what Florida or Washington State or other states are doing about reporting, but I was also going to recommend even looking at, like, I'd happily show you our online reporting tool, how we share information back to folks. Is it the best tool? Probably not. Are there room for improvement? Absolutely. But looking at what different organizations are using for reporting tools, see what you like and don't like. There's a lot of GIS mapping software that's kind of off the shelf. You still need to build it, but there's some programs. But looking at like what does local jurisdictions do for like complaint based to other sort of reporting, there's a number of tools out there that I think could help you guys do that research, see what you like, don't like, what's the cost, what's the pros and cons, and you can get a little bit further on that. So that would just be my recommendation, because there's a lot of, the wheel's been invented.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. Especially, you're absolutely right. I mean, it'd be a good idea to not just look at reporting tools specific to ADVs, but public, complaint driven type reporting tools. There are certainly probably a lot out there. So that's great advice, and some that will follow.
And thank you, Stephanie. And it's nice to be able to get your experience into this discussion too. Andrew.
Yeah, just another thought about these reporting. It's good to know why you want to do it. So if you're looking to take this to your legislature to say, here's the scope of the problem, that's one audience. If you're turning around to have this to the general public, totally different audience, totally different process. One will take a lot more upkeep and maintaining than the other. So I would just say, look for or identify exactly what your target for having this is, and work backward from there. You probably pick one or the other, because you can't probably do both with them.
So being clear about the outcome of what you're looking for in the final product, so you know where you're headed. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so any other comments about that? I am going to also ask about the last line here with regard to DSL is going to develop criteria for classifying ADVs to aid decision making. Any thoughts about that, and things that DSL might be needing from your perspective to consider in tackling that? Okay, so we've got Rachel.
Hi, Rachel Fisher, NMMA. I would say, and I think I've said this a couple of times, but classifying ADVs is really important. I know the state of Florida, they do like 3 iterations of what a derelict boat means to the state and how they prioritize it, from something that needs to be taken care of immediately, or something that could have a little more time and maybe more public output with regards to that. And then I will also add definite classification of ADV recreational versus commercial, as those are 2 completely different topics when you're thinking about handling them.
Great. So yeah, again, bringing out the recreational versus commercial division there and developing criteria. Great. So Stan?
Yeah, Stan Tonneson, Rocky Point Marina, and board member of WU. Just want to throw out the sensitive issue of people living on the boats so that they're classified, because that seems to be a very big challenge. I just want to put that in there. Thank you.
So that would be a consideration as well in that criteria. Do you have people that are living on the boats? Okay.
And just on that real quick, and that's why Dorothy did a good job of talking about, thinking about boats, these boat profiles more holistically than just, 120-foot boat made this year, made out of this material. There are a whole lot of other considerations that would go into whether any kind of action is taken on any vessel. And one is certainly what Stan brought up, but there are also a whole lot of others, environmental factors, other socioeconomic factors. What we're trying to say with that is there's a whole lot that goes into classifying an ADV. And also, we use the term classifying and not prioritizing, because we don't want to make it seem like every boat at some point will become the priority for the state, when in reality, similar to what Rachel mentioned with Florida, certain boats may be in classifications to where, hey, they're just not a top priority right now, and they might not be, at least for the state, given current funding restrictions or anything else. So that was some of the thought that went into that line. Thank you for all your input, by the way. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And any other comments before we move on from reporting, mapping, and classifying? All right, so I did mention at the beginning about the need to be succinct and the need to allow airtime, but we are making great time here and there is room. So if you've been holding back a little bit, please don't hesitate to jump in here. So want to make sure that DSL is getting the information that's going to be most helpful as they take this iteration into the next step of the ADV program. All right, the next element that we have here is technical assistance with DSL consulting with the relevant subject matter experts to ensure information is relied to seekers is accurate and beneficial. Any thoughts here about pieces that are missing, something that's a challenge, something that ought to be considered as that gets developed further? I'm finding if I pause long enough, there's usually a hand that goes up, but I knew it. Stephanie.
Stephanie with Metro, I'll bite. When I think about technical assistance and who may be the user of that, it makes me think of different manuals and guides that other state agencies like DEQ have created. What's the issue? Here are the different steps and considerations. It kind of walks through, it asks people questions, kind of links them to information. I know Andrew had mentioned the disposal resources. We've talked about this before. It's going to be an important conversation with DEQ and others to making sure that we have authorized permitted entities to handle the waste stream. And I think that's where we tend to see a lot of folks discarding their boats inappropriately because they just don't know where or how. It's overwhelming. But just thinking of some sort of step, not step by step, but just like a framework of these are the considerations. There's some decent examples out there, and I know like other states do similar things. So as you think about this, what are the questions people are reaching out to DSL, Oregon State Marine Board, DEQ, and others? What do they need, and how do you kind of answer those questions, kind of like an FAQ that can be really helpful?
And then that, Stephanie, also gets to topic or element that we'll be talking about in a little bit, which is the outreach and education. It seems to be a little bit of crossover here with regard to this being part of that. Would that be fair, Stephanie?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Josh, did you have anything to add on that?
No, not at all. But I completely agree that the technical assistance and the outreach education piece in many ways are kind of blended. As was said earlier, there is a need to connect different members of the public that may be coming at this ADV issue or even just old boat issue from different directions. And we need to make sure that we're in a position to connect those folks with the resources that are out there, understanding that they're all not here. I mean, we can't necessarily give advice on how to conduct a possessory lien, at least not from the kind of legal standpoint. But if we know how to connect, people that need that information with those that might be able to provide it, I think that's us filling the role. But again, Stephanie, thank you for the input.
Thank you. All right. Anyone else with regard to technical assistance? Anybody ever run into an issue that where this comes into play for you? Okay. We will continue on and let's I'll tell you what, I'm looking at the clock. We're almost at 2 o'clock. Why don't we take our 5-minute bio break right here? And let's come back at 2:04. So, all right. Thank you very much. We'll be back on at 2:04. All right, we'll start gathering back. And great, I see some videos coming on, which tells me we've got at least some of you back, and maybe more of you are back, but don't have either video mute on or mute off. So let's continue this conversation here. And the next part, and the next element that we're going to look at the ADV program proposal element is prevention. And let's take this, there's 3 different parts to this that are listed on the slide. And let's take it in the 3 different sections. And the first really has to do with the DSL is going to explore how insurance and bonding requirements could be employed to prevent vessels from becoming ADVs. And that become the financial responsibility of non-owning parties. Any thoughts about that? Is there anything missing in that concept there? Is there anything that you think is challenging or anything that you think ought to be considered? Again, related to insurance and bonding requirements. I know we've had some discussion around that in the past. Sergeant.
Yeah, Steve Dengler, Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. Is this something we'd have to approach the state about in regards to creating new law on insurance requirements for vessels?
So Sergeant Dengler, potentially, depending on what this could mean. I mean, there's nothing that stops certain, private mortgages or ports for establishing, insurance as a condition for mortgage. If there was going to be let's say a blanket state law for all watercraft need to have some sort of coverage, insurance coverage for whatever, that would certainly require legislative action. That would be something that would have to be pursued. If the department pursued it, it would be through a legislative concept of ours, or would have to be brought forward by another lawmaker. So it kind of depends, depending on what type of requirement that you're looking at. But if it was something statewide, yes, that would require state action. That's not something that this department or any other could adopt through like administrative rule.
Great, thank you, Josh. Thanks, Sergeant, for the question. Any other questions related or thoughts related to the insurance and bonding requirements being explored? Mike.
Yeah, I know we've talked about this a good bit. Oh, Mike Dunning, Port Coos Bay. We've talked about this a good bit over the past few meetings. I'm in strong favor of something like this. Understanding, yes, it will have to go through legislation to get there. I've long believed that we require people to have auto insurance to drive a vehicle around. There's boats that go 60, 70 miles an hour. People need insurance to have a boat as well. Again, probably a long process determining what level of insurance that is, but the state has long encouraged all the public ports to enforce insurance policies in their marinas, and I think the majority of them have gotten there. We were one of the last, but if the state is encouraging us to do that in our marinas, they should make it law in the entire state that folks need to have a certain level of insurance to operate in state waters. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Mike. Appreciate the feedback on that. So any other thoughts about insurance and bonding? I saw somebody else's hand go up but then go back down.
Yeah, that was me, Mr. Jensen. Mark Landauer with the Public Ports. I was just going to chime on, and Mike made the point that most of our public ports do require insurance as a condition of moorage. So we've gotten to, I think, generally that point, although we could probably be a little bit stronger on it. And that's all I had to share. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that. Sergeant Dengler.
Yeah, Steve Dangler, Multnomah County. I love the idea of insurance. You know, it's something that works well on the streets for, you know, driving uninsured. It's the realm of being able to tow a vehicle for not having proper insurance or licensing. So we run into a little bit of a dilemma when we talk about insurance and then who is going to be responsible. So we still end up in the same dilemma each and every time where we don't have a contract or contractors in place on our waterways to take vessels in such circumstances. So that continues to be that ongoing struggle where I would love to see that piece and that element that would help us alleviate a lot of our abandoned derelict vessels, as well as our transient vessels in and around the metro waterways. But again, we still have to have that angle of being able to physically remove those vessels once action is taken.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the validation on that, and then but also in terms of raising some of the issues to be considered. Anything else on insurance and bonding requirements? All right, let's skip down to the next piece of prevention, and that's evaluating options for increased prevention in leaseholds. Oops, Kate, I meant, yeah, thank you. And leaseholds and waterway authorizations. Any thoughts about that? Sounds good to everybody? Sounds like a good option to be evaluating and looking into from everybody's perspective. Okay, it sounds like everybody's feeling pretty solid about this. I'm trusting people to jump in there. So let's move down to the same slide, but in terms of exploring mechanisms through likely through legislative concepts that are more clearly and effectively holding parties responsible for ADB liability for cleanups, including secondary liability for those selling at-risk boats, and clarification regarding titled owners and responsible parties. Any thoughts with regard to exploring that? Are there any challenges, any things that you would see as issues that might come up if DSL was to move down this path?
Well, Eric, I actually have something to say if I can figure out where my hand is.
Okay, yeah.
There.
I've got Andrew first. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Andrew can go first.
No, go for it, Josh.
Well, I was just gonna point out, I should clarify a little bit what's written at the bottom of the screen regarding titled owners versus responsible parties. Right now, and we've experienced this, I've experienced this many times. Boats can get to a point where truly legally there is just no responsible party from the legal perspective. We know that the owner is no longer the owner, but yet being able to attribute that boat to anyone else is difficult given some of the current laws that are in place. So something to kind of clean that up, and I'm speaking very broadly at this point. I don't have the specifics of this concept, but something to alleviate that challenge might be beneficial in helping us, find responsible owners. But also, if those mechanisms are in place to find responsible owners, that actually serves as prevention of the broader ADV problem, as people understand that, there's a possibility that you could be held accountable, financially liable if you do produce an ADV. So sorry, but I want the work group to weigh in.
Thank you, Josh, for the clarification. Andrew?
Yeah, my comment here is just, these are all really good ideas, I think, but one large area that none of these will address is vessels that are coming in from out of state. And so having some sort of plan for how you would also wrap in those vessels that aren't registered in Oregon, aren't registered in Washington, but could be coming from any other state or any other country potentially too, is how do you account for them within this prevention plan?
That's a really interesting point, Andrew. And so from the prevention side, being able to figure out how do you deal with those that are coming in from out of state. So thank you for that. And any other comments with regard to prevention? Anything else like that might be missing?
Just to respond to Andrew real quick, I think that's a great ongoing question. And in our framework, we want to identify those questions that, hey, these still need to be answered. And the one that you just posed there is an excellent one. Like that's a tough question. I have no idea what the answer looks like, but I want to make sure that we identify those things to continue to work on. Like, yes, we will do these certain things, but we're also going to seek some answers to a question like that. So that kind of contribution is very helpful as well. So I appreciate it.
Great, thanks. We have our Washington expert, Troy.
Hi, Josh. I've ran into this problem actually. I've taken possession of a vessel that was owned by someone outside the state, and it actually went all the way up to my executive management and then over to the AG's office. So in order to get someone financially liable for this vessel in another state, you have to go through your superior court and then that state superior court. And then you have to hire a lawyer in that state to put liens on properties and stuff like that to try and recoup your costs. And in some cases, it's just not cost effective. But depending on the cost, do you really want, the question I got asked was, do you really want to be the big bad guy going after a 60 or 70-year-old lady in another state to recoup your costs for that boat? So unfortunately, I work for a political elected person, and the answer was no.
Right.
So I'm just saying, you might want to talk to the decision makers up above you just to see how far they're willing to go.
I think that's an excellent point. I think we've run into things like that. I've run into things like that previously. It's a good consideration. And also, you brought up a point there too that maybe is not clearly delineated in this framework, and I'll make sure that it is going forward, is acknowledging that there's a lot of legal knowledge and expertise that will need to back up this program. When we talk about civil penalties and liens or interpreting potentially complicated or new laws, and we're going to acknowledge that, hey, that needs to be a function of the program. The rest of the program can't function well if we don't have adequate legal support if and when we need it, which will be often, I assume.
Right. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Troy. And Troy, I just want to point out that you run the program up in for the state of Washington with the Department of Natural Resources. Okay, anybody else have thoughts about prevention? Stan.
Stan Tonneson, Rocky Point Marina, Blue Board member. Just wanted to add on to the out of state. We have issues here in the Columbia River where we have both Oregon and Washington boats in our marina or abandoned on our waterways. So perhaps some sort of a intergovernment agreement between the two states so you wouldn't have to go through that lengthy process that Troy described. Thank you.
And thank you, Stan. Interesting thought. Josh, did you have a follow-up comment on that?
No, my only follow-up comment was going to be to Troy that, I think there is, given our shared, Columbia River resource, and given that is an area that has some and ongoing concerns. I think there's some merit to that idea, but something that we will probably include in the framework as something to explore.
Great, thanks. Troy?
Yes, so there's precedence for this because the sheriff's departments have memos of agreements, MOAs, that they can police from shore to shore. They can't go up like the Willapa or anything like that, but from shore to shore on the Columbia, they can police. And so there's precedent for it. I've been trying to talk to my AGs about that, but due to our own internal duties and stuff like that, it's fallen to the wayside. We've talked about this a couple of times with our task force and our brethren down in Oregon. So it's a great idea. I just think we need to push forward with it with our AG's offices.
Yeah. Great, thank you, Troy. All right, any other comments on prevention? Yes, Andrew.
I just wanted to jump in and say if there's anything I can do from the federal perspective to help coordinate that interstate agreement, let me know. Happy to at least say that NOAA is supportive of that effort.
Andrew, if I may, brief question. Is there precedent for that type of thing at other places in the country that you're aware of? Tell you what, we can explore that later, but this is I'm interested in this.
Let's take that one offline. I believe, I know there's some other states that work very closely together, especially like in the Northeast with the states having much smaller coastline. But yeah, let's follow up.
Sure. Sorry, Eric, back to you.
No worries, no worries. And Andrew, thank you for volunteering to help there. Okay, one last call for prevention. All right, now we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk about disposal. So this is this element is where DSL will consult with DEQ and other regulators to communicate about reported barriers and explore possibilities for standardizing regulations around vessel dismantling and disposal. Anything that you see missing from this? Anything you think is going to be a challenge? Anything that you think should be considered in moving forward with this particular element of the program? Difficult to argue with consultation. But it sounds good to everyone. All right, I'm just stalling just a little bit for people to find buttons to press, but I trust that everybody's had an opportunity now. So let's move on. Process and procedure improvements with DSL exploring legislative concepts related to waterway waste that will account for ADVs that no longer meet the definition of a boat and do not warrant the seizure and storage procedures as currently written. So looking to bring some clarification to that. Troy.
So I think it's going to come down to your definition of a vessel. Because we have a restoration program here at DNR for Washington Waters, and they go up and they do a lot of debris removal off of beaches and stuff like that, cleanup, stuff like that. And when they come across, obviously, a vessel part that's no longer able to operate as a vessel, they pick it up as trash because at that point, it's marine debris. So that might be another definition you might want to look at, especially NOAA's definition of marine debris when it comes to ADVs.
Really good point, Troy. And yeah, looking at the ways that you can change definitions that help with the execution and function of getting the job done. So, all right, Chris.
Yeah, Chris Hathaway, Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership. Definitely a lot of this is going to be dependent on legislative action, which is too bad that so much of it has to depend on those folks, but hopefully they can rise to the challenge here. It does seem like a lot of headaches could be solved by different definitions of what a boat is after a period of time being abandoned, something like that. I mean, to me, it seems like if a boat has been out there in the same spot for 6 months, for 8 months or something, it's like there should be some sort of statute of limitations or something where ownership doesn't really apply anymore. I don't know, anything that I think you all can do to kind of speed up all the background legalistic stuff that gets in the way and costs money prior to removal would be really, really good.
Great, thank you, Chris. And again, goes back to definitions and being able to clean that up legislatively. So just want to pause for half a second. Josh, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, not at all. I appreciate Chris's thought there. I have some thoughts of my own that kind of mirror Troy's. I mean, I also know, actually, to Chris's point very briefly, there's precedent in other states for if a boat is out of registration for some period of time, the title, the ownership, that's essentially that it's vested with someone that disappears. If you don't register your boat in 10 years, that boat's found somewhere, you're no longer like the title owner. I'm not saying those are things that we might necessarily pursue, but that's what I'm trying to get at here with those legislative concepts to try to improve some procedures, especially those that I don't think were written to deal with the issue that we're dealing with now. So I guess I would just say I share Chris's, in some ways, his frustration with the current limitations on what we need to do to do this work.
Great, thank you. Mike
Dunning, Portuguese Bay. So kind of a minor detail, but I think we want to not focus on when it does not meet the definition of a vessel anymore, because most definitions of vessels are pretty standard, federal and state, throughout the country for the most part. I think it needs to be, it's always going to be a vessel, but in these situations and what these are have to be determined. You won't be warranted to do the seizure and storage procedures as currently written. So I think we need to define when a vessel no longer has to meet these requirements to be seized. That makes sense?
Yeah, so you're talking about establishing a threshold, if you will, for when do you cross that line where it's no longer an ADV, correct?
Well, when it's no longer, well, what I'm saying is,
by definition.
Yeah, get away from and not calling it a vessel anymore. It's always going to be a vessel, but establish criteria of when you don't have to go through the seizure.
Yeah.
So somebody said it here a minute ago. If a vessel's been sitting on the bottom for X months, X days, I don't know what the number is, it's still a vessel, but you can seize it because it's been sitting there for a year, 2 months, 6 months, whatever the number is. That would be the new criteria.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Mike. Troy.
So, if a vessel's been there for so long that can be considered abandoned, I think the sticking point here is whether it's going to be a vessel or whether it's going to be marine debris. I think the definition of marine debris would help you out a lot. And vessel, as long as it meets the definition of a vessel, then you're probably going to have to go through your procedures for custody and stuff. But if it's marine debris, it's litter. You can go out and pick it up. In some cases, you might have to get a permit from whoever owns that property. But yeah, so we have 30 days on state-owned aquatic lands. If it's anchored out there for 30 days, it's considered abandoned. And then we can start the custody process and remove the vessel. I think you're already leaning towards that. So I think just identifying what marine debris is might be your better bet, because then it wouldn't be attached to your program per se. It could be attached to like restoration or something.
Thank you, Troy. Andrew.
Another thing to consider if you're talking about legislative aspects to pursue, or at least when you can take seizure of a vessel, would be to look into when U.S. Coast Guard is involved, so that when Coast Guard comes out to, if there's a diesel spill or something related with a vessel sinking, Coast Guard's authority ends as soon as the vessel is chemically cleaned. So if you could have something where as soon as Coast Guard's involved, you have the option to step in, take ownership, that then you could actually leverage the work that Coast Guard is doing in refloating a vessel instead of them just refloating it, delightering it, and letting it sink again. Because that would potentially save a lot of effort and funding. And I'm sure Troy's got lots of good thoughts on that too.
Yeah, well, let's ask Troy since he's got his hand up. Do you have thoughts on that, Troy?
Absolutely. So we work very closely with the Coast Guard in Washington State, and they do reach out to us as soon as they think they're going to raise a vessel in order to pump off fuel, oil, or whatever. And they do give us a chance to take custody of it. And what we do is we take emergency temporary possession of the vessel, which allows us to take immediate possession of it once they've raised it. We usually hire the same contractors that are raising the vessel for the Coast Guard, and they make the vessel safe. Then we go through the custody process before we do anything else with the vessel. But we're allowed to, under our statutes, to take emergency temporary possession if it's a danger to human safety or the environment. And when the Coast Guard's done pumping off those vessels, they usually let it sink back wherever they found it. And that's just a risk to human safety and the environment at that point. So that's why we have emergency temporary possession.
So the point being here is that once the Coast Guard gets involved, that gives you a bridge and an opportunity here to be able to address it. So
absolutely, it saves us money too, because the Coast Guard's paying to raise the vessel, and then they're paying to get all the hazardous material off. So now all we have to really worry about is the disposal part and the storage for the amount of time we have to do due process. But raising a vessel off the bottom is probably the most expensive, next to the hazardous waste disposal, like asbestos or lead paint or something like that.
all right, thank you. Appreciate it. Any other comments with regard to process and procedure? That was a really good discussion. I appreciate everybody's thoughts on that. Not seeing any other hands, let's move on and go to outreach and education. And so this one is somewhat straightforward. We've got DSL will utilize current best practices for identifying affected parties and sharing information effectively, recognizing Oregonians are diverse in a number of ways. And we'll try to strive to employ a variety of channels for improving information, which include proactive and interactive engagement, as well as readily accessible online resources to accommodate different needs and preferences. Comments with regard to what's being proposed here, Troy?
Sorry to keep chiming in like this, but the majority of the people that you're going to have problems with, the vessel owners and stuff, they're not on social media. They're not on the websites and stuff like that. They don't read newspapers. So that's the challenge of this outreach and education, is getting to those people that are going to be the majority of your issues. And that's really knocking on doors, going out there and handing out flyers to vessel owners and stuff like that, walking docks and putting flyers on boats and stuff that might look like someone's walked away from it for a couple of years. So those are just some suggestions, but that's my hardest problem too, is getting the message out to these vessel owners that aren't on social media. They're not in the newspapers or on websites or anything else like that.
It's a really good point, Troy, and it's something that sort of goes across different topics and industries, and in terms of the folks that you really need to reach aren't the ones that are necessarily accessing that information or paying attention to that information. So thank you for that. Andrew.
Yeah, and Josh and Dorothy, I know you have plenty of experience with this, with our previous grant of how do you reach the people. And I think the working with the marinas was a really great opportunity for that. But I would also suggest potentially, it looks like here you're just looking at options within DSL to address the outreach and education. I would encourage you to look at some of the nonprofits that are out there that are already dealing with a lot of these issues. I can't really promote any one. The one I can is Oregon Sea Grant, because they're part of NOAA associated. But you know, just to leverage some of those existing organizations that have outreach and education programs already out there, and to look into like partnering with them on funding. You know, that's the type of thing I think NOAA Marine Debris Program would love to be able to fund in the future. Is how do you prevent these from happening in the future with outreach and education? So anyway, just some ideas there. Make sure you're considering.
Great, thank you very much. Troy.
Aaron's absolutely right. I work with Sea Grant. I also work with Clean Harbors. I work with a lot of these organizations that touch boaters in some way, including our state parks that has a safe boating program. The problem is getting to those people that aren't participating in any of that. They're transferring titles on napkins and bars instead of going through registrations and stuff like that. Those are the people that are going to be the hardest ones to get to. And it's not a problem that I've been able to solve other than Josh, have you heard of our dock walking program? Okay, then I don't have to explain it here then. Okay, thank you.
But it's a program, I'm very aware of it, but a program I'm very supportive of and would like to see how we can emulate that type of thing here. So thank you.
Yeah.
Troy, is there anything you'd like to add about that program at this time?
Only that we don't currently have that position filled at the moment, but when we did, it actually brought revenue into the state. What I mean is, in 1 6-month period, the dock walker was able to pull in about $56,000 in revenue from registration fees and stuff like that. So it pays for itself. But yeah, that's just one benefit from it. The other benefit from it is you identify which vessel owners are no longer taking care of their vessels, and you can offer them the vessel turn-in program at that time. So you can capture it before it becomes an issue.
Yeah, so combination of sort of soft enforcement and as well as some assistance along the way. So.
Absolutely. We called it an outreach program because we weren't threatening them. We were offering carrots instead.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. All right, Mike.
Mike Dunning, Port of Coos Bay. To kind of latch on to what Troy was saying, I think you do have to find a balance. I think this is important. To me, I think this is the outreach and education. I'm not saying it's not educating people on the impacts of abandoned derelict vessels. It is educating them on this program and potentially new legislation that is going to be in place. Again, to Troy's point, doing that, we're keeping the honest person honest is what we're doing. The folks that are the ones that are going to dump vessels, you could put them in a classroom 6 days a week for 2 years and they're going to go out and dump a vessel regardless. So it's an important piece of this. I think it'll be very informative for folks as this program evolves and what it evolves into, especially if there's new legislation enacted. But again, you got to balance resources and what we're going to put in and what we're going to gain by going overboard with it, I guess is where I'm going.
All right. And again, pun not intended with overboard. Okay. So, Troy.
Yep. Sorry to keep harping on this, but our dock walking person is usually a college student, and then we give them a stipend, so it's low cost.
Great. Good to know. Good to know. All right. Anything else with regard to outreach and education before we move to the last item? Josh.
Yeah, just a suggested addition to what we currently have, especially given some of the input from Mr. Tonneson earlier. And it seems like we're missing a piece regarding in kind of outreach and education, regarding the unhoused community and how to do outreach and education. Understanding that there is a nexus with that community and the ADV issues. So something I'm going to make sure that is spelled out more specifically is the need to coordinate and work with those providing social services, seeing where we can assist in that field, and also to make sure that our efforts are in line with other relatively unrelated efforts to address other issues, other concerns for the state, including houselessness and issues with mental health. So I think that's something I'll make sure is in this section, because there is a connection there, and we need to not only acknowledge that, but work to support other things going on in the state outside of the big old boat world. Troy, go ahead.
Yeah, so don't forget your law enforcement officers in your outreach with that social side. They usually have cards that they get printed up. They have numbers for all kinds of social services and stuff like that, and they offer them to people when they go out and meet with them. We've gotten our DNR officers to put our information on those cards when they hand them out, because sometimes they go into a marine environment and stuff like that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Reaching out to social services is a great way to do that. We even brought social services out to some vessels to talk to the vessel owners to encourage them to move on shore instead of out on the boat. So yeah, that's a great idea.
Excellent. Sergeant Dangler.
Steve Dangler, Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. As far as the compliance of those that live aboard on their vessels, one of the things that we've run into is the fact that it's a lifestyle choice by these individuals, and they're swapping boat after boat. Again, we're not dealing with the typical individual, that would see things on the news or in social media and be able to get that outreach and those resources. Our folks have been offered those resources. They choose to elect to live the way they do because they know they can skate the system.
Thank you, Sergeant. All right, we're closing in toward the end of this discussion period. Any other comments on the outreach and education before we head to the last slide here, or last slide on the elements of the program? Seeing none, let's go to other functions. And this is, as Josh had pointed out, is kind of catching a lot of things that didn't fall in these other categories, including initiating ongoing communication with entities whose product resources or regulations intersect with ADV response, as well as talking about legal tools the DSL has available when dealing with noncompliance with pertinent laws and liens and civil penalties, restitution measures, and then also looking at ways to ensure self-reliance when accessing sites and carrying out administrative tasks, etc. So any comments about what's here, other functions, or is there anything else that didn't get captured in these other elements that you'd like to bring up at this time that you think is important to consider? Troy.
I know you guys know this already, but I love leveraging other agencies to help out with this stuff. And so sometimes we arrange work groups, kind of like this one, but it's just an interest stakeholder group for a particular area. We'll draw in harbor masters, sheriff's department, fire department, first responders, a lot of them, ecology, which is your DEQ. And we talk about the area and the issues that are important to them. Like, where do we take those boats when we take custody of them and stuff like that. And as long as you have that open communication and relationship, you can usually work through a lot of those problems with, okay, this agency is going to take care of that while this agency takes care of this, and move on. And it lowers the cost for everyone involved. But I would encourage that outreach to include groups like that. You could have like a Columbia River group that would talk about issues that are important to them in that area, including vessels. So,
and that goes directly to that first paragraph there. I think is what was intended. Correct, Josh?
I mean, intended broadly, although Troy's more specific suggestion is a good one and very well taken, and something that I think we'll certainly look to implement in Oregon.
Good. Andrew?
the thought I had going back to the issue with the unhomed community living on vessels and kind of going vessel from vessel, as the sergeant said. Something that the Marine Debris Program has funded in other areas that might be applicable to this is with gear, like derelict gear return programs, doing a bounty for small amounts of money for gear return. And when I say small amount of money, I mean literally small amount of money, $5 to $10 for return gear. I actually found that if you get too much more, people start stealing gear to return it. But just if you're targeting a certain population, a certain subgroup, I wouldn't offer it largely, but to target those people who just would abandon because they don't have anything, a very small amount for bounty for a VTIP, your vessel turn-in program might be something to consider. Just was on my mind. Wanted to share it right now. That's all.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. At this point, let's take a pause. We can come back to this afterwards if it need be, but I want to make sure that we get our opportunity in for community input. And so I'd like to move to that slide. This is the opportunity for anybody who's not on the work group to share any comments, questions and thoughts. Ask if there is anyone in this online here, if you would raise your hand when you'd like to speak, or press *9 if you're on the phone. I will call on you in order. Please stay muted until you're called on. And when you are, please say your name, where you're from, any organization or interest you're representing, and we're going to ask that you limit your comments to 2 minutes. So with that, is there anyone not on the work group that would like to share some thoughts or questions? Again, I'm giving just a little bit of time for folks to be able to find that magic button to raise their hand. Okay, so not seeing anyone. Let's go back and go to the previous slide if you don't mind, Kate. So just wanted to wrap up the other functions elements that are here. Anything else that anybody would like to contribute with regard to this? Okay. This has been a really helpful and good discussion, I think, for DSL. It helps to understand where you're seeing some areas that you want to validate as an area that you want to make sure that it's part of the DSL ADV program. It also helps to figure out some of the missing pieces, as we did, that might be considered, and some of the challenges going forward. So thank you very much to everybody on the work group for doing that. Would like to add that this is not, as Josh has pointed out to me, this is not the end all in terms of giving comment. Josh is welcoming additional comments, questions, or things to think about during the next week and possibly a little bit beyond. So feel free to reach out to him and to share any additional thoughts with regard to this this proposed ADV program framework. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Josh. Well, actually, we have one other slide here. So one of the questions that Josh and his team have is, what we've got this sort of scoped out to April 2024. What do you envision that it would be your future as a work group, would be your future involvement once we get past April? What would you like to see as the way that you would be involved going forward.
And that's not something that we need to necessarily answer right now, but it's something that I want to spend a lot of the time at the next meeting discussing, because that we really want to ensure transparency with the program, but also understand that public involvement, other expertise in our decision making is needed. Every decision maybe should not be made just individually, unilaterally here in Salem. So I just encourage you to think about ways that we can make sure that, yes, the public is available to participate in our program. You're available to participate in our program, but also that we have all the information, all the perspectives needed to make informed decisions. So kind of look at it from our point of view. How do we get all the information that we need from people on the work group, from some others that might be not on the work group? That's what I want to try to get at in a couple weeks.
All right, so if you have thoughts about that, you've got a little bit of time to think about it. Andrew, you have your hand up?
Yeah, well, thank you for thinking beyond this effort. And I think selfishly, there's an obvious one for me, and that's the Oregon Marine Debris Action Plan, which that plan is ending next year. So in 2025, the plan is up and will be a new plan. And so part of that will be an opportunity to bring the entire marine debris community together. And so hopefully by 2025, you'll have a pretty good roadmap for where you're going. I have a good start on this. But I can say within other states, like in California, their Marine Debris Action Plan community comes together around pillars and issues. And so there could be an abandoned and derelict vessel group that would meet quarterly, twice a year, whatever regularity would actually make sense for the group. But that would be an opportunity to connect beyond just this working group, but with all the different groups that are working with marine debris issues. So I'm more than happy to help facilitate that when the time comes around, just to throw that out and plant that seed now.
Thank you for that offer, Andrew, and we'll assuredly take you up on it.
Mike?
Yeah, Mike Dunning, Port Coos Bay. I think it's critical for involvement of this group. I don't know if it's an advisory committee as this gets developed. I mean, this is just the framework at this point. But I really do think you need a sounding board of the folks that are doing this every day, which is mostly the marine owners, Marine Patrol, and the ports. So I think continuing this on is some sort of advisory committee as you develop and we look for legislation and the different programs is a crucial piece to this. I agree with you, Josh.
All right, some good thoughts here. At this point, I'm going to turn back to Josh. If you have any thoughts, final remarks?
Like I always end with, I really appreciate the thoughtful consideration and suggestions that you're all willing to provide us. I hope that you see the progress being made, by this work group from our initial conversations to now. I mean, coming towards, as Mike said, it's still a framework. But I think we truly are getting somewhere, and that's in no small part because of you willing to participate in these meetings and provide your candid feedback. So that's it. I look forward to a conversation in 2 weeks, and like Eric said, if you have other things that we did not cover today, please get a hold of me. At this point, I want to make sure that any potential ideas are included in the framework that we present. Not that that's not subject to change then going forward. We certainly will maintain flexibility in the program, but I'd like it to include all potential avenues that we've identified so far for exploration. So again, don't hesitate to reach out, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.